So thanks everybody for joining today. I appreciate having so many folks come out for this training. It's something that we did in person almost 6 years ago. Chris Hansen and I did, and I know it was an overwhelming response to that. And I know there's a lot of folks out there because of the COVID and that trying to get a 106 training is very difficult. So I'm happy that we're able to host this, and a big thank you to Savannah for organizing this and getting the registration going. So for those of you who don't know who I am, I'm Chris Merritt, and I'm the Utah State Historic Preservation Officer. So every state, territory, and has a SHPO by 1966's Historic Preservation Act. I am the governor appointed SHPO as title. I'm the officer, but I also have a great group of people here at the office, the SHPO. So we had conversations over the last year that it's probably time to get another training out. And with requirements, we were hoping to do it in person, and it just wasn't safe for you or us. So that's why we switched it to the virtual platform. And hopefully that still gets you a little bit of engagement. Savannah has created a 100-question test that she will give you over the course of this morning to keep you engaged. As you guys know, and I do it personally, trying to stay focused on a virtual training is a little bit difficult because you have emails coming in, you might have phone calls, you might have cats. So we've tried to find some polls to keep you interested and engaged throughout the entire 3-hour block. So the basic breakdown is the morning, the first hour or so, we're going to talk about really the process of Section 106 and its state law equivalent. And then we're going to switch into more of a historic buildings focused discussion of site forms and some basic styles and some information that you guys will be needing. And we thought it was a good way to kind of bring that bigger conversation of, we're not just archaeologists. Those of you who are doing out there, doing cultural resource management, you're dealing with the archaeological record, but also the built environment. So thanks to Chris Hansen and Corey Jensen for organizing a little bit more of a building discussion. So that's really the introduction for me. I'll let Savannah introduce herself, and then Chris Hansen, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Hey everybody, I am Savannah. I'm the compliance archaeologist for the Utah SHPO, which means I do everything Section 106 and UCA 9-8-404 related to archaeology and archaeological resources. I'm going to launch a poll here just in a few seconds about everybody's knowledge on Section 106. We kind of want to gauge where people are. So look out for that in a second, and I'll hand it over to Chris Hansen.
Right. Hi, everybody. My name is Chris Hansen, and I do the Section 106 architectural reviews in our office. I'm a preservation planner and a deputy SHPO in the Utah SHPO. And I'm happy to be here today. I'm excited about this training, so look forward to it.
Thank you, Chris. And I don't see Corey online yet, but we will have a fourth member of the SHPO team joining us to do the historic building discussion. Corey Jensen, our National Register Coordinator. I believe he's dealing with a cat issue this morning. So that's life working at home, right? So without further ado, welcome. I just wanted to point out I am in the office today. We have relocated our offices to 3700 South Highland Drive in Mill Creek in the Salt Lake Valley. So we are out of the Rio Grande Depot for at least the next 2 to 3 years, probably pushing more than 3 years, while it gets seismically upgraded and also repaired from the 2020 earthquake. So we have relocated our offices. Thankfully, almost all of the archaeological records have been digitized, so you guys will not see any real difference in accessing that. Those of you who do need to do historic building research, we are actively scanning all those records, all the building files, both general and National Register. We've now finished Utah County. Salt Lake County is currently the big beast, and we've finished scanning it. It's now being cleaned up before being uploaded. And then we're going to be starting to go Sanpete County, and then probably just alphabetical after that. So if you do need a historic building record or National Register nomination that's maybe outside those zones or our scanned records, please feel free to email myself, Chris Hansen, Corey, anybody, and we can either facilitate checking it out for you, and it's now in the Highland Drive building, any of those boxes. Or if it's a bigger file search, maybe we could coordinate an in-person file search if that's needed. So I just wanted to convey that for those of you who are here for more of a building side of the discussion. So I'm not going to belabor the introductions anymore. I know Savannah wanted to do a poll to gauge your interest right out the gate, so I'll let her do that first. And just a reminder to everybody, you are being recorded. So if you don't want to have your picture on screen, make sure to turn it off.
All right, so I'm going to launch poll number 1. Hopefully it should show up on your screens. It's just a little question about how to gauge your interest or knowledge on Section 106.
Oh, it's creepy to see it live streaming here. It's like duking it out here between moderate and advanced understanding.
Okay, looks like we've got 94% participation. That looks like people have stopped answering. So I'm going to go ahead and end it and then see if we can share the results. So overall, pretty good. The highest percentage was moderate understanding, so that's great. What we're going to cover today is really just the basics. We're not really going to cover Utah specific like programmatic agreements or even the submission process for how we do our compliance. However, if you guys are ever interested in a training like that, we are always happy to provide it. Reach out to us. But the Section 106 training this morning is just going to be more of just a blanket overview of what the process is and how to do it. So I think with that, Chris, we can go ahead and jump in. Chris Merritt is going to do about the first half of the Section 106 training. I'll do the second half. We'll have a break, and then we're going to jump into Chris Hansen and Corey Jensen's architectural training. So I'm going to go ahead and share the presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Savannah, while you're getting that pulled up. Those of you who are in the moderate and advanced, I think all of us exist somewhere in between that do this on a daily basis. And every day we get something new that confounds us or pushes like our understanding. And as we talk about the law today, there is a little bit of squishiness in the law. There's a little bit of vagueness in places that sometimes great, sometimes a little bit frustrating. So when you practice this cultural resource law in Utah, you're dealing with, a good federal law that's been around for 55 years at this point. And we're getting there. We're getting to a good understanding. Our agreements that we won't be talking about do help refine some of those understandings, but we need to always work in concert. And I know a lot of agency archaeologists out there haven't dealt with a memorandum of agreement on an adverse effect because it's not something you typically do. And so that's why our office is here as support for you all to help you navigate this process, to keep you legally defensible in case of challenge, but also to make sure we're protecting cultural resources by doing the law as best as we can. So thank you all for joining us today. And hopefully we'll get those folks that are minimal, at least to the moderate by the end of this morning. So next slide, please. So this is our basic training module. This covers both the federal law, Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, and also the state law equivalent, Utah Code Annotated, Title 9, Chapter 8, 404, which is Section 106 Light. And we'll talk about some of the differences as we go through that today. You already met the team. These are the 3 individuals that do the bulk of the reviews. I don't do as many reviews as I used to. Savannah is now in the World War I trenches when it comes to Section 106 and 404. And I appreciate you all trying not to mustard gas her because she's keeping me sane. So thank you for doing that. I'll keep the World War I analogies to a minimum this morning. And then over the course of the last year, we actually had Corey Jensen doing a lot of our Department of Transportation reviews and Chris Hansen doing everything else. But we've reallocated Chris Hansen's time to include DOT reviews and allowed Corey more time to do his other duties. And it feels like it's working out pretty well. Well, we'll see once the infrastructure bill lands and UDOT starts building everything in every corner of the state. So Chris Hansen is your reviewer for architecture. So go ahead. So in Utah, we have 2 cultural obligations when it comes to law. On the one hand, we have the federal. And you've probably heard at this point, and I saw it in the poll, you've heard of Section 106. And the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966 has several dozen sections of different parts of code, whether it deals with National Register or with tax code. Section 106 of that law is the obligation of federal agencies to comply with law to take into account their actions on cultural resources. And this is federal funds, lands, permits, approvals. And we'll talk about where that language comes from. In Utah, we are one of a few dozen states that has a state law equivalent, 106. And it is in our code as Utah Code Annotated 9-8-404. And it's much shorter, it's much more streamlined, and it's a little bit pithier. We actually spent a little bit of time a couple years ago cleaning up some of the vagueness in that language, but it's great. We have a state law equivalent in Utah to protect cultural resources on state lands, or if there's using of state funds or permits or approvals. So very similar to 106, but it does break apart in a couple other areas. Next slide, please. So those of you who've seen our training, you've probably seen this slide before. And I like to always say it, is that this law, whether federal or state, is a planning tool. Both are saying before you commit to an action, before you permit an action, before you disperse funds, you're supposed to take into account your actions on cultural resources. So it's really truly a planning tool. It is not something to be done after the fact, and except in extremely rare circumstances. And it is also a recognition that historical values are public values. Both the federal and state law in their preamble say that all Americans, all Utahns, have a vested interest in the protection and stewardship of cultural resources, whether that's a 13,000-year-old Paleo-Indian site or a post-World War II housing tract. You know, that there is historic values even in the most sometimes routine and mundane materials, and that we need to be thinking about how we take those into account during our projects. Compliance does not mandate preservation, it encourages. There's no, I always use the analogy of the Monopoly game. There's always a pass go in both these laws. Neither can put up a roadblock and say no. Sometimes that's very frustrating. But as many calls as we get for people complaining why laws doesn't stop projects, we get as many worried that it would stop their project. So there's a middle ground that at least if we do the process right, we can't save everything, but at least we're going through due diligence as best we can to encourage preservation. Also, both laws really focus on decisions are made through consultation. Now, state law doesn't have as much public input as the federal law does because it's not mandated, but there is consultation. There's consultation with our office, with Public Lands Office, if there's a state undertaking. So there is still consultation under both laws. And that's the hope is I don't have all the answers. Savannah and Hanson don't have all the answers, but that's why we work through it in consultation to try to find that great middle ground, or at least if we tick off everybody and everybody walks away disgusted, we probably did the right thing. Nobody won, nobody lost. Everybody got upset. That's fine. That's how the law works. And then the last point is the agency makes the decision. If this process isn't followed appropriately and it goes to heck, you're the one that's going to get sued. We are not going to be sued. The consulting parties aren't going to be sued. The tribes aren't going to be sued. You are the one that makes the decision under this law to allow an action to move forward to disperse funds. And so at the end of the day, the agency is responsible for those actions. Next slide, please. Here's some links, and we'll share this PowerPoint after the presentation as we normally do too, so you can follow these links to your heart's desire. The Section 106 regulations are spelled out in 36 CFR 800, which is just another way of codifying the very complex federal laws. So the Act of 66 is very broad. It is basically some mandates. You will follow this, you will take it into account. The 800 is the rule book. It is your IKEA manual of how to assemble a bookshelf. Sometimes it doesn't make sense. Sometimes you need more drawings to help understand how the 106 works, and 800 is there for that reason. It's about 16 pages or so, single spaced. It's a little bit more complex and a little bit more specific. 98404, there is no enacting legislation other than the actual act. So it's both the rule book and the mandate. And it's a little bit shorter and more straightforward, but those are the links for you right there. Okay, big block of text. And as a professor, you never use big blocks of text because you see everybody's eyes glaze over. But it's important to highlight that underline is that in the enacting legislation for section 106, and I already said it several times, take into account the effect of the undertaking on any district, site, building, structure, or object that is included in or eligible for the National Register. And you see even before that highlight prior to the issuance. That's where we come in, is one, you should be taken into account before you do any of these actions. And two, you're assessing your actions impact on districts, sites, building structures, or objects. These are National Register criteria. And those of you out there that maybe don't have cultural resource professionals, sometimes this is a black box because you can't look up our records. You can't see what's on the National Register is easy, but that's why we're here to help you. We can have that conversation, or if you're hiring a consultant or your proponent's hiring a consultant, this is what they're doing, seeing what the effect is on these known quantities. Thank you, Savannah. So who participates in 106? And you're going to see throughout this presentation, the bottom corner of the presentation is going to have an orange box. That orange box highlights areas that state and federal law separate. And so this slide is really the participants in the federal process. And those are the agencies. So whether it's HUD, the Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, Bureau of Reclamation, the FCC, those are the agencies that are driving this bus. The Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, they're a non-governmental, or they're a governmental agency, but they're not part of any other parent agency at the federal government level. Their council's position is to help make sure all 50 states and territories are trying to follow the process similarly, trying to make sure that there's established standards that go nationally, because all of the SHPOs kind of run their own programs. And then every federal agency has their regional offices. And so it's really easy for us to go feral if we don't have some constant oversight. And that's what the council does. Also, the council could be brought in if it's super controversial or if our office is getting political pressure. We can actually tap out and have the advisory council consult with the agencies directly and remove us from the equation. We've never had to do that in Utah, and I hope they'll never keep it that way. And then consulting parties. This can be, non-governmental organizations like the Utah Professional Archaeological Council or the Weber County Heritage Foundation. It could be members of different avocational groups outside that. It could be historical societies. Anybody that has a vested interest in the undertaking from a cultural resource perspective are consulting parties. And then, of course, the public. All federal agencies are required to do public notices and to take public comment on the proposed undertakings. And so the public has a say, and this is very difficult. And with 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 undertakings a year, having the public really understand what's going on is difficult. But in the bigger projects, it's a little bit more easy to get the public engaged because usually there's a big NEPA undertaking, big stakeholder meetings, and you can kind of layer on the 106 in. Next slide, please. So we're the SHPO. So we're the State Historic Preservation Office. Our office actually goes all the way back to 1973 when we were created. So a few years after the passage of the federal law. And our job is to advise and assist, provide insight to federal agencies or others that have delegated authority. Sometimes that's Department of Environmental Quality because they have some EPA delegated responsibilities, or Verizon and Sprint, who has delegated authority from the FCC for cell phone towers. We can create agreements to streamline and to review process. And so many of the agencies we've had had both federal and state cooperative agreements that allow some actions to move forward quickly. If there's more than one state involved, usually SHPA will delegate, usually by who's the most affected. Right now, we have 3 separate interstate projects going on that have multiple SHPOs engaged. Our relationship has been codified through agreement. And so if you're on one of these borderland projects, you're going to be dealing with two of us, which is fun. And then I've always had this, is when we've done a training to an agency that maybe hasn't been the most compliant, they're going to be like, oh, you're going to get so many cases. Like, don't scare us. I mean, Savannah's already going to be in years of therapy when she gets done doing 106. It's because we do them all. Everything has to be consulted by the SHPO by federal regulation. Now, those agreements can help streamline and cut things out and make us more focused, but don't scare us with more paperwork. We eat it for breakfast. Next slide, please. So effectively, both laws are a 4-step process. I'm going to walk you through step 1, and then Savannah's going to walk you through 2, 3, and 4. Step 1 is the easiest. That's why I get to do it. It's really, is it an undertaking and how to initiate the process? Both laws follow the same thing. Does it stand a litmus test of it? Is it an undertaking or not? So let's talk about step 1. At its base core, step 1 is it a thing? Is it an undertaking? Is it something that needs to follow through the process, whether state or federal? Also in step 1, we're trying to coordinate with other reviews, whether that's a NEPA review, whether that's internal federal agency reviews for other aspects. We try to coordinate early because that usually helps. And then during the same process, if it is an undertaking, we start identifying consulting parties who would be interested in this project, because there's a big difference if the project's in Fillmore or Blanding. You know, the consulting parties are going to be radically different. And so we need to think about that. And then also to, of course, create a plan for the public. So very quickly, that picture that was on the right, this goes back to 2014. This was the decommissioning of the Carbon County power plant that was right there outside Helper. It was privately owned by Rocky Mountain Power, and the decommissioning action was actually not a license or a permit. And so there was actually no undertaking for the decommissioning of this really awesome historic power plant. So we went on a tour to talk it out and see this facility before it was decommissioned. But there's an example of how we talked it out and it wasn't an undertaking. Okay, next slide. So the agency determines whether its action meets a definition of an undertaking. Where this is law, words have meaning. So undertaking is an important meaning here. And let's jump down to definition. So an undertaking is a project, activity, or program funded in whole or in part under the direct, my boxes are covering it, direct or indirect jurisdiction of a federal agency, including those carried out by or on behalf of the federal agencies, those carried out with federal financial assistance, those requiring a federal permit, license, or approval, and those subject to state or local registration and administered pursuant to delegation. Whew, that's a mouthful. But that is basically anything that the federal government is proposing, whether that's a federal highway expansion or the BLM doing a vegetation project. Funding, so USDA Rural Development, they give out federal loans for housing and for infrastructure. Those are federal funds. Those are undertakings. Permits, the Army Corps of Engineers does tons of permits. So all of these things are defined as an undertaking. So next slide, please. So the definition of an undertaking is broad intentionally, because when they passed this in 1966, there was a recognition, as shocking as it is, that the Congress could not understand all the potential ways the federal government operated then or in the future. And so it is a broad definition. A lot of folks think it's only federal funds. It's not. It's permitting, its license. And so the example is 100% state funded project that requires a federal permit will bring it into federal consultation because Fed will always trump the state's role in these. And so even if there is a state funded action and you're crossing a waterway, you're going to have to be dealing with federal law, which is a lot more complex and a lot more technical than state law. And so that's why if you understand this is coming down, you need to be reaching out to us and your federal partners to help that process along. It's always a real frustration when somebody suddenly realizes that there's a federal hook and their project now gets behind. And suddenly cultural resources becomes the problem. And in reality, it was not understanding the connections before you really started down a path. Next slide, please. Under state law, and we just cleaned up this language to be a little bit more clear, we brought it into alignment with the federal definition of an undertaking. And so before expending any state funds or approving any undertaking. So approval in this sense is permits and letters of approval and funds. It also includes state lands. That's also another part. So it's really the same thing, whether you're on federal or a state project, state money, state land, state permits and approvals. And this law, like I said, has been around since 1973. And most state agencies are working to improve their programs internally to hit this standard because, again, the legislature in 1973 said there was a point and a meaning to protecting these cultural resources. Next slide, please. So you have this thing presented to you, and you're an agency archaeologist or you're an agency permitter. You have to have gone through this litmus test. Is it an undertaking? Yes or no? Is there a state permit involved? Is there a federal permit involved? Is there state funds? And sometimes it's a little bit mushy and the connection is maybe unclear. So in the Carbon County example, like the decommissioning action of that power plant had no federal connection, but the demolition and the reclamation of the fly ash had an EPA and Army Corps nexus. And I see Mark Kapinski on here, he remembers that very well. And so sometimes it's not one part of the action, it's another part of the action, but that's why we're here to help facilitate. Is at step one, you need to say, are you in the game or aren't? Most times you're going to be in the game, unless we've exempted some actions from law, but you're still complying with section 106. You also have to document the finding, because even if you say this is not an undertaking, if someone challenges you, you have to have a good rationale for that. So it's always important to document that for the project file. And then at the end of step one, if there's an undertaking and it has a potential to cause effect, we go to step two. And so there are undertakings every day that you guys do that has no potential to cause effect. You guys go to Home Depot and you buy some lumber. You're expending federal funds. By definition, that's a federal undertaking under section 106, but there's no potential to cause effects to a historic resource. So those are the easy way that we can kind of thin off a lot of administrative and a lot of simple projects like that. It's those next tier ones where, okay, you're buying lumber for a reason. Holly, yes. Does 106 apply to private property? If that private property owner is receiving federal funds or a federal permit or license. So if the private homeowner is getting a HUD loan, HUD has to comply with law. USDA Rural Development, this is their bread and butter, working with private landowners. NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, which is part of USDA, they don't manage land. Everything they do is helping loan money to farmers to do new pivots, or to change conservation practices, or to do emergency stream repair. All of those are on private land, but because of that federal nexus, they are having to comply with that. Now, there's always going to be problems. Some private landowners don't want archaeologists on their property, but they need to be reminded they're the ones that are requesting federal support. We run into bigger issues on these big interstate power lines where the private landowner has very little say in the action. And so those sometimes they get denied. And then Steph Wacha, sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, Waka, She asked, who identifies consulting parties, the SHPO or the federal agency, if on public lands? For identification of consulting parties, we do it in collaboration. So the federal agency is supposed to take the first cut. They're supposed to know, usually through their NEPA process, that environmental, they've identified the local governments, non-governmental organizations, private citizens. So they've usually identified a good list. But if it's a bigger undertaking or a complex one, we often ask the federal agency to let us consult on that list. And then we usually add additional ones. Just last week, we have a big new transmission line. The federal agency and its consultant identified a list of consulting parties. They sent it to us for comment. We sent back another 3 or 4 that they hadn't thought about. So there is a little bit of both parties interacting. And we didn't go into detail of what is a consulting party, but it's someone that has a direct interest in the cultural resource end of it, or someone that has a legal or economic connection to the undertaking. So thank you too for the questions. So I think I'm transitioning to Savannah after this slide. So this last slide here just shows you that you can exit at step 1. All four levels of 106 or 404 process, you can exit. You can be done. So if there's no undertaking, like you don't have a permit, you don't have any oversight, you're done. Or if you have no potential to cause effects, like buying a new fire truck, which we get a lot of times under state law from the Community Impact Board that uses money to help local communities. They buy fire trucks using state funds. There's no potential to cause effects. We're done. If there is an undertaking and there is a potential, that's when we move to step 2. And then I will throw it to Savannah.
Yeah, so we're going to do a couple of poll questions on what Chris just talked about. I do want to clarify that the private land question. So Chris, in his example, had federal land or federal money. It also applies to state money. So if you're getting money from the state, that's going to be an undertaking under our state law, not necessarily federal. So it's going to be kind of a simpler process, but it's still similar to Section 106. So we're going to go ahead and launch poll number 2, if it'll let me, and my cat is needing some pets right now. So I also apologize if I have a barking dog in the background. Sometimes can't control that, as I'm sure you guys all know. Okay, I have launched poll number 2. Hopefully y'all can see it. Has a couple of questions, so I'll give you a few minutes to answer them. Okay, looks like it's slowed down, so I'm going to close the poll and then we're going to talk about the answers. Share results. Okay, hopefully y'all can see that. Number 1, who would you reach out to for architectural questions? And most of you got that right. It's Chris Hansen. He is our architectural reviewer. You can reach out to Chris Merritt. He'll just send you to Chris Hansen. So Chris Hansen is our official architectural compliance officer. Some people answered E106 at utah.gov. That's a bit of a trick question. I put that in there because when we do send our consultations within our internal system, it comes from an email that appears as E106 at utah.gov. That email is actually not active. And a lot of people actually try to email it. And so maybe we should put something on our website. And so I kind of put that in there as a trick question. So please don't ever email that email, even though you might be getting stuff from my email. I know that's a bit confusing. Number 2, who would you reach out to for archaeology questions? And most of you got that right. That's me. Good job. Number 3, what law mandates cultural resource compliance for state land, state funding or approvals, or state funding? I wrote that incorrectly. I meant to say state permits or approvals instead of state funding. And almost everybody got that right. It is our UCA 9-8-404 law. Some of you answered Section 106. It's a state law, or it's a state law, not federal law. So Section 106 is only for federal nexus. The National Environmental Policy Act, that doesn't have to do anything with cultural resources. So that is not the right answer. The last one, do Section 106 and 404 mandate or require preservation? 81% of you got that right. Good job. No, like Chris said, you do not have to preserve cultural resources. As we'll talk about, you will have to mitigate those negative impacts. before you can, release your funds or before you can approve your undertaking. You will have to mitigate, usually through a legal agreement. But it does not stop projects in their tracks, which is something that a lot of people, especially that aren't in the field or in the cultural resource realm, they don't understand. They think, oh, we've got a historic building that's significant, like we can't tear it down. There's nothing we can do if they're getting federal funding. Especially like real estate agents, for some reason, they think that if you have a historic building, you can't modify it or anything. And that it's just really not true. And so that's one thing I like to educate people and really bring that point home. So good job, everybody. That is our second poll. We'll have the third one after my section, and that one's going to be more questions. And so look out for that. And I've got the chat open, and so I'm seeing questions come in, but it's kind of difficult with the screen share and everything. So Chris Merritt or Chris Hansen, if you see a question, maybe let me know if I don't see it, or we can answer them at the end when I'm done with my presentation. And I'm not as eloquent as Chris, and so I apologize if I'm not as interesting to listen to. So step 2 is to identify historic properties. Chris talked about the beginning, the process, why we do it. The public has a vested interest. Determine if you have an undertaking. If you're actually going to do the process, if you're going to do your cultural compliance, your Section 106 or your 404. Obviously, if you have a yes, you move on to step 2 in that step that has the arrows that we showed earlier, and the snippets are down here at the bottom of the slides. So if number 1 is a yes, you move down to step 2. Determine your scope of efforts. And so a lot of you are familiar with what an area of potential effects is. That's going to be included in step 2. Identify historic properties. Usually first, you're going to go out there and you're going to see what cultural resources you have. You'll hear me use the term cultural resources versus historic properties, and we'll talk about what the difference is between those two. And then if you have cultural resources, you want to evaluate the significance of those cultural resources, which is their National Register status. We're going to talk a lot about the National Register, which is a really important part of this compliance process. The National Register was also something that was created in that 1966 National Historic Preservation Act, where we get our authority and our guidance for almost all of this process. So a historic property, many of you I'm sure are familiar with this definition. Chris kind of already brushed on it. The definition is any prehistoric or historic district sites, buildings, structures, or objects included in or eligible for inclusion in the National Register of Historic Places maintained by the Secretary of Interior. So think about those different types, right? We've got districts. So that's something that's very big and very complex. I live in a historic district in Murray, the residential historic district. It's actually listed on the National Register, and my house is contributing to that. So that's a really big complex resource. A site in archaeology we have, or in Utah, we have archaeological site definitions. We have definitions on what is a building or a structure. So those are the next two. And then we have objects. So yes, one object can be eligible for the National Register. In archaeology, we usually record those as isolated finds or isolated occurrences. And technically, the agency should be evaluating significance of those objects. And then the next part is really key. And I think most of you probably know this already, but it's really important for people who maybe don't understand the process and, the people who are managers or people that aren't, doing the process every day. So historic properties that are included in, so they're listed on the National Register already. They've gone through the process. They're listed. You can Google it. It'll come up on the National Register. Or eligible for inclusion in. So that means it's not on the National Register, but a professional has assessed its significance and its integrity and determined that it's eligible for listing on the National Register. Those two things receive the same treatment in the Section 106 process. So even if you have nothing listed on the National Register in your project area, You might have archaeological sites, you might have historic buildings or structures that are going to be eligible for listing on the National Register, and those receive the same treatment. In the National Register, it's kind of a way of determining what's the most significant or what's worthy of preservation. I know for, an ethical or a philosophical standpoint, of course, all cultural resources matter, right? But in the law, we have to balance our development and everything. And so this is kind of the way that we balance our interests as a society and improvements and development and things like that versus preservation of cultural resources. So you're going to determine your scope of effort in step 2. So before you go out and identify historic properties, where are you going to identify historic properties? You want to know where. This is what is called an area of potential effects. I'm sure many of you have heard that, or an APE. Some people say APE. I don't really like that term. I usually say APE myself. But that is basically the legal definition under Section 106 of what your project area is. And it's called the area of potential effects because it's the area where there's a potential to cause effects to cultural resources. Now that means direct effects, like you're going to be digging in the ground, and that's a very direct effect, or indirect effects, which could be, over time you have a cumulative effect. You have people walking on a trail that could potentially, start to erode an archaeological site, or you have, a road that's kicking up dust that might go onto rock art that's right on the road, which is, 9 Mile Canyon, a really popular example of that. So once you've determined what your area of potential effects is, and we're going to talk about that in more depth, review existing information about your historic properties. This is difficult for some agencies that might not have access to our archaeological database. I do want to note that our historic buildings database is open to the public. So unlike our archaeological database where you have to have a professional archaeological permit to access, anybody can go online and look at our historic buildings database. Agencies that are consulting with us that don't have access to the archaeological database, a lot of the times they'll look up National Register and they'll look up their project area and say, there's no properties on this area. And that's really great that you did the research and that you did your due diligence there. So do we have existing historic properties? Maybe if you have access to the archaeological database, has there been a survey before? Do we have documented archaeological sites or buildings, that kind of thing, while you're determining your scope of effort. In this step, also federal agencies want to seek information from parties that are likely to have knowledge or concerns about the area. So not everybody working in cultural resources or doing the Section 106 process is an expert. I don't know a lot about the resources in Utah. It simply cannot, right? I know about certain areas, but other people, especially members of the public that maybe live out in those areas, they know a lot. They know more than the federal agencies do. And so that's why Section 106 brings in public input in this step and in the whole Section 106 process. Is because they do have a vested interest and they do carry a lot of knowledge in the state and anywhere really. So area of potential effects, let's look at this definition more closely. So the actual definition in 36 CFR 800.16 is a geographic area or areas within which an undertaking may directly or indirectly cause alterations in the character or use of historic properties, if any such properties exist. So that's very broad. It's going to be based on, like it says there, the size, the scope, the context, and also the visual intrusiveness. So visual effects, I think they used to be considered indirect, but I believe the ACHP has changed them to direct effects recently. But if you're putting a huge cell phone tower right next to a building that might be eligible for its architectural significance, its aesthetic value, that might cause negative effects to the integrity of that site, to the setting, to the feeling of that site. It might even cause it to not be eligible for the National Register because the area around it has, changed so much, it's no longer retains its historic character. And so that's an example of not a direct effect, maybe as a physical effect, but, like a ground disturbance effect, but a more indirect effect. Think in 3D. So it's not just like, it's going up into the air. You've got your cell phone towers, you've got your ground disturbance. So how far are you going to be digging in your undertaking? And, these are all details that not only the agency needs to consider, but you also need to include in your consultation to SHPO. We love details. And so how wide is your ground disturbance going to be? How deep are you going to be going? Other things like, are you going to have a staging area for equipment? So it's not even maybe permanent areas of disturbance, it could be temporary. So if you're just going to have a staging area of, your bull hog or whatever for vegetation treatment, that should be included because it can cause a potential to, or it can cause an effect to cultural resources potentially, right? So the area of potential effects is very broad. It's something that the agency needs to determine themselves. Sometimes I get questions of, hey, can you determine my APE? No, I cannot as a SHPO. I cannot. You as the agency, I can help and I can advise, but the agency is ultimately responsible for your definition of area of potential effects. And like this photo, this little graphic here, maybe you don't want to define your area of potential effects as this rectangle when your project area and your effects of your project are going to be, this blue area and these little blue triangles. You want to make sure you're encompassing everything that could potentially be infected. A lot of the times that also means multiple areas. And so maybe they're really spread out. You have like a vegetation. Yeah.
There's a question in
Okay.
the chat. I don't know if you want to address it now, but Lee Bennett asked, what about landscape level visual impacts, e.g. switching an agricultural area to a shopping center?
That's one of those complex questions. That's going to probably warrant a very in-depth review of significance of that landscape. Landscape resources are really hard to deal with. They're really, they're important and they're significant, but, as a Section 106 process, we need to think about it more holistically, and sometimes that's difficult. So maybe, I don't know, you have a better answer to that, Hanson.
No, I agree. It would need to be looked at pretty closely and evaluated at that level. So.
Yeah, and so it really depends on your resource and, your scope of effort. So like, if it's going to be a shopping center, that's a pretty big effort, but maybe there's like a few really small impacts happening and that might change your scope of effort or how you're going to evaluate significance. Are you going to contract out like a 400-page report from a consulting firm on the significance or not? So yeah, I mean, like Chris said at the beginning, Chris Merritt, like we don't have all the answers. Cultural landscapes are honestly the most complex and difficult resources to deal with, even though they're really great and I love them. Flexibility and identification effort. And so I just kind of touched on this. Maybe not all projects require a full-on archaeology survey or a full-on architectural survey. You want to like consider what the effects are. What is your undertaking going to be? Maybe it's actually going to be something that's very minimally intrusive, and you still have your area of potential effects. You still have to identify historic properties, but maybe you don't have to do a full scale effort. Maybe there's past studies like, oh, it's been surveyed before. These resources have been evaluated recently. Then I'm done, right? I don't have to do identification efforts, as long as SHPO agrees that that's a legitimate survey, we accept that, or these are legitimate evaluations of significance, and we agree that it kind of would be a waste of money to do it again. Nature and extent of potential effects, location of historic properties. And so maybe you have an area that's completely previously disturbed. Okay, so your project area is on a parking lot. Probably don't need to do a survey or any other type of identification effort, because maybe other than a site visit, because there is basically no potential for historic properties to exist. Sometimes there's going to be stuff buried under that parking lot, very rarely. And so a lot of the times within consultation in those situations, sometimes agencies will include like a discovery clause. Hey, while you're doing your project, do you, if you see anything, you're going to stop work and bring in SHPO or bring in your agency and kind of determine what to do from there. You will also want to look at your applicable standards and guidelines and consider confidentiality concerns for archaeological sites. So just a friendly reminder to everybody that archaeological site locations and other sensitive information is protected under several laws, federal and state. One of those is the Archaeological Resource Protection Act, or ARPA, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard of. And so it can be difficult, number one, if you're an agency that doesn't have access to our archaeological database, because you have to have a professional permit to have access to that. And I apologize, my dog is barking now. There must be somebody walking in front of our house. If you are working with a client and maybe it's a bit difficult that you don't want to expose those or disclose those archaeological site locations to the client. And so that's something that is always, should be considered in this process. Evaluation of significance. So I've talked a lot about this. You determined your APE in step 2. You are going to go out and you're identifying your historic properties, whether that's an actual survey or not. And say you have cultural resources. They're there. When I say cultural resources, I mean anything that's archaeological, structural, or historic building. So anything that's historic or archaeological in nature. Generally in Utah, we define that as anything that's 50 years old or older. And so those are cultural resources, just broadly defined, right? And then your historic properties are just cultural resources that are eligible for the or listed on the National Register. So when you're evaluating significance, just a few questions as you're going through the process. Is it already listed on the National Register? Obviously, that's an easy one. 90% of the time, it won't be. In Utah, most of our our listed National Register sites are buildings. So it could be maybe an archaeological site, probably very, very small chance that it's actually listed on the National Register. But it could be if you're, working in an area like 9 Mile Canyon or something, there's potential. Has it been previously surveyed? So like I said, maybe it's already been recorded and perhaps that's an old recording or perhaps it's a new recording and somebody else has already actually evaluated the significance and SHPO. We have accepted it into our database and concurred with those determinations. If those things have not happened, and sometimes if those things have happened, or if it's been previously surveyed, but it's really, really old survey, say it's from like the 1970s, that data is probably not going to be super accurate, especially since they didn't have GIS data and GPS technology back then. We usually ask for go again, survey again, reevaluate significance, because things do change and we do want to go out there and ground truth a lot of the time. But if nothing has been done, you're going to apply the National Register criteria and for significance and integrity to determine the eligibility of the cultural resources that you have. Determine if they are historic properties. Have to have consensus on the determination of eligibility. So what that means is when you're consulting with SHPO, we are going to either concur on your determinations of eligibility, say, yeah, we agree that this is eligible, great, or we agree this is not eligible, therefore it's not a historic property. A lot of the times we won't agree. We'll either know something you don't, or we'll notice, an error in the documentation or something like that. And we'll open up a conversation with the agency and say, hey, are you open to making this eligible? X, Y, and Z are our reasons, or vice versa. And usually we'll come to a consensus 99.9% of the time. We can, update that documentation as needed, and then we have a consensus of eligibility. So the SHPO generally has to concur on the eligibility determinations in this process. Properties have to possess integrity to be eligible. Like I said, integrity and significance are the two things that determined eligibility. Integrity is a bit of a deeper conversation that we're not going to go into today. But it is important to know that you have to have integrity and significance. There are 7 aspects of integrity, and there are 4 aspects of significance. Many of you are probably familiar with what those 4 are. Luckily, there is only 4, which is pretty easy to remember. The UNESCO World Heritage Sites list has 7 aspects of criterion, and that's more complex to remember. So I'm glad we only have 4 here. So the National Register is a listing of resources identified as worthy of recognition or preservation. Okay, so it's kind of our way of recognizing the most important, the most significant, worthy of preservation. Of course, as academics, everything is important, everything is priceless, everything is non-renewable, but this is the way that we define it in the process and on the National Register. Like I said, usually about 50 years or older, and it possesses integrity. And then it has to be significant under one of these criteria. Criterion A is known as the events in history or the local trends in history, so broad trends or events. And every one of these can be significant under a local, a regional, or a national level. So there's different levels of significance as well. Criterion B is easy to remember. It's associated with a significant person or a group of people. This one can be a bit tricky because usually it has to be not only be associated with an important person, but also an important thing that they did in their lives. So even if it's associated with an important person, but it's from a time period in their lives, or it's something that wasn't significant to their lives or what they did historically, it actually doesn't rise to that significance of criterion B. So criterion B is kind of difficult, and it's pretty rare too, but it happens. There are sites that are eligible under criterion B. Criterion C is architecture, construction, or aesthetic qualities. Usually this means buildings, right? It's a unique architecture. It's a super cool aesthetic, that kind of thing. We do sometimes have archaeological sites that are eligible for the National Register under criterion C. And then criterion D is our archaeology criterion, which is ability to yield important information. That doesn't mean that only archaeology can be eligible under D. That's not true. But most of the time, archaeology is going to be eligible under criterion D. That means that we can study that site and learn more about the past. Generally, that means that there's subsurface deposits, or there's archaeological materials that are buried underneath the ground. An archaeologist, can excavate and learn more information that's significant about the past in Utah. So the rule of thumb there, easier way to remember: A is association of events or trends in history, B is big people, C is cool buildings, and D is data. So we're going to go through some examples here. Criterion A, Transcontinental Railroad. So everybody probably knows what the Transcontinental Railroad is. A significant transportation project that happened in the late 1800s in the US. The Transcontinental Railroad united here in Utah, up in Promontory, north of the Great Salt Lake. This is a trestle of the Transcontinental Railroad. If you go out in that area, there's a railroad grade, there's railroad sites that were associated, or railroad towns that were associated with the railroad and the building of the railroad. So that's a pretty significant event on a national level. So the Transcontinental Railroad Archaeological Site is eligible under criterion A for the National Register. And I'm going to kick it over to Chris Hansen for these next 2 because they are buildings, and I don't know much about buildings, but he does.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Savannah. Like Savannah mentioned, criterion B relates to properties associated with significant people of the American past. So the Lewis A. Ramsey example here, the Lewis A. Ramsey House, in Salt Lake City, was listed on the National Register because of its association with its owner, Lewis A. Ramsey. Ramsey was a notable artist in Utah for many decades. He is known for doing paintings in LDS temples, such as the Hawaii Temple. And he's also known for his early paintings of national parks and other landscapes found in Utah and throughout the West. It was said he was the first fine artist to paint Cedar Breaks and Bryce Canyon, and he became famous for his paintings in Zion National Park. And importantly, not only did he live in a house, but he also had a painting studio in this house where he actually created some of his masterpieces, which raises the level of significance under Criterion B. And Criterion B is actually not used that often. There's a rather high threshold for listing under this criterion. Most nominations we list are under A or C. So next, Savannah. Let's see. So criterion C, once again, as Savannah mentioned, relates to architecture. It concerns the distinctive characteristics of a building by its design and construction, including having great artistic value or being the work of a master. The Casino Star Theater in Gunnison, as you see here, was listed on the National Register under Criterion C because it's a fine example of the Beaux Arts architectural style, especially in a small rural community like Gunnison. You don't see that very often in small towns. The Beaux Arts style is classically influenced, but also has rich and large-scale detail and ornamentation. It was designed and built to stand out in the community, and a local businessman financed that project in 1912 to kind of boost Gunnison. So that's Criterion C.
Thank you, Chris. And then naturally, I will do Criterion D, which is the archaeology or mostly the archaeology criterion. So this example is the archaeology at Fort Douglas, which is on the University of Utah campus. This archaeological site is from the Potter Street excavation, which was actually an inadvertent discovery where an archaeological site associated with historic Fort Douglas was found inadvertently during a project with ground disturbance. Unfortunately, in this situation, the University of Utah, which is a state agency, did not do the process. They did not do their consultation properly or do the historic research. And so as the undertaking was happening, archaeological sites were found. And it resulted in a large scale excavation. And these are some of the artifacts that came out of that archaeological site. These are Civil War era artifacts, as you can probably tell by the style. And in that photo to the left there is where the archaeological site was buried. So, like I said, sometimes we have a project going on in pavement and, there's no archaeological sites on a parking lot. Well, they might be underneath the parking lot. So always something to consider when you're determining your area of potential effects or your potential for historic properties or cultural resources to exist within your area of potential effects. I think this is time. I'm going to launch another poll for you guys. Kind of covering what we just talked about. These are, I think, are pretty easy and they're only 2 questions. So hopefully it'll be quick. I'm going to launch it just to keep everybody engaged and awake. I know I do not pay attention during virtual trainings. I'll just admit that. So we're trying to keep you all engaged. I know it's hard. Hopefully we can do this in person sometime. Okay, doesn't look like anybody else is answering. So I'm going to end it and share it.
Well, I don't think you should be able to unmute. I think or maybe you can.
Yeah, that should be me in like the polls. Like I can't see that at all.
That's really
Let's see. Sorry. Just lost the poll. There it is. Most of you got both of these right. Good job, everybody. Number 1 is true or false, and AUPE should only encompass areas of direct project impacts. That is false, because there are potential for indirect impacts to occur. Visual impacts, atmospheric impacts, which is something I didn't talk about. I think we'll cover it here in a minute. There's also, what's the other one? Visual, atmospheric, and I'm blanking right now. Okay, so we have direct impacts that can happen. So most of you got that right, good job. Number 2, archaeological resources can only be eligible under Criterion D for the National Register. That is false. Like I said in my example, the Transcontinental Railroad is an archaeological site that is eligible under criterion A. And there are archaeological sites that can be eligible under criterion B and criterion C as well. So good job, everybody, on that. Okay, so the end of step 2, you have determined, thank you, Chris, auditory is the third one. You have determined your APE, you've identified your resources, you evaluated those resources, you're evaluating their significance for the National Register. So you either have historic properties in your area of potential effects, which are those deemed eligible for or listed on the National Register. You don't have historic properties is the second situation. So either you just didn't find anything, there's nothing there, or you did find cultural resources, but they were determined to be not significant for the register or not eligible for the register. And that's been something that's agreed upon with SHPO. So therefore you might have archaeological sites, you might have historic buildings, but they're just not eligible. And so they're actually not considered historic properties. And so in these situations, that's going to be a no historic properties finding. So that's easy, right? You have no resources to consider in the Section 106 process. And usually in that, and we're going to talk about that in the next step, that's going to be a conclusion of your Section 106 process. These are compiled into a report, your identification efforts, your area of potential effects definition, your determinations of eligibility or your evaluations of significance, usually compiled in a report and submitted to SHPO for review, to submit it to me or Chris Hansen for review. And that brings us into the conclusion of step 2. After historic properties have been identified, the agency is going to apply the definition of effect from 36 CFR 800, which is alteration to the characteristics of a historic property qualifying it for inclusion in or eligibility for the National Register. So in this situation, if you don't have historic properties, so there's nothing there, or you have historic properties, but they're not going to be, or you don't have historic properties, excuse me, but you have cultural resources, but they're not eligible, you're going to have a formal finding of no historic properties affected. That's easy. At that point, your Section 106 process is complete. Once SHPO has reviewed your official finding, your official determination, and that is usually done through like a formal consultation letters, all that kind of thing, through our E106 system most commonly. Once we send you a letter back concurring on those determinations, that is your conclusion of your Section 106 process from the SHPO standpoint. And so you can, at that point, release your funds, start your undertaking, before expending or, funds or approving an undertaking. So that's the language. That's the language in 404, right? And so actually, once you're done with the process, you can go ahead and move on with your undertaking. A no historic properties affected finding. So like we just talked about, that is when an agency determines that there are just no historic properties in your APE. That is the easiest way to conclude a Section 106 process. Of course, you can't determine if you have cultural resources or not, but it's always the quickest, right? If you have no historic properties. If you do have historic properties, but your undertaking will have no effect. So basically, you have a historic property here. Your undertaking is going to go over here, and it's not even going to get close. It's not going to touch the boundary of that historic property. That is also appropriate for a no historic properties affected determination. Of course, you have to make sure that a stipulation that your undertaking will not affect the cultural resources or the historic properties. You have to follow through on that during your undertaking. Actually, make sure the undertaking is not going to impact historic properties, like you said. But at that point, the process is also over. In the process, though, once you submit determinations of eligibility and a finding of effect, under 36 CFR 800, SHPO does have 30 days to review and comment. That's 30 calendar days. In our E106 system is how most people submit. We have just an electronic tracker that says how long cases have been in our queue to review. So we have 30 days legally. SHPO may disagree with an agency, which triggers the next step. It could either trigger the next step of, yes, you will have historic properties affected. That's step 3. What are we going to do then? And there's lots of different situations that can play out. Usually we do not, or we agree, or we can reconcile our understanding. Sometimes it's done in collaboration or consultation, talking about lead effects and, if something's eligible or not. But if SHPO doesn't have an objection, we agree, yeah, you have no historic properties, or yes, the site's not eligible, we agree, no historic properties affected. We send you a letter back, and at that point, your Section 106 compliance process is complete, and from SHPO's standpoint, you can go ahead and implement the undertaking or release those funds or approve that permit. So that's the end of step 2. Step 3 is you move on to step 3 if you do have a historic properties affected determination. And that can mean 2 things. That can mean in your determination of effect language that there's going to be a no adverse effect, or there's going to be an adverse effect. But once you have historic properties and you determine that there will be an effect, that's when you go to step 3 and you assess your adverse effects. So if historic properties are affected, it says agency notifies the consulting parties and invites them to comment, and the agency will apply the criteria of adverse effect and notify SHPO of their finding. Most of the time, it does not meet the thresholds of adverse effect, and we can have a no adverse effect determination and move on that way. The agency, if you're using the federal process, if you're using Section 106, must consider the views provided by other consulting parties and the public. So again, you're involving the public in every step of this process for the federal side, not so much for the state side. It makes it a tiny bit easier. So the criteria of adverse effects, this is not a full list of what they are. The ACHP does have a full list, 36 CFR 800 does have a full list. But basically, you want to consider the indirect and the direct effects to historic properties. So direct effects are going to be very direct, obviously, like that historic building is going to be demolished. That archaeological site is going to be trenched through for a fiber optic line. Okay, these are very direct effects. Indirect effects, like I said before in my example for APEs, a visual effect. Are we going to have a cell phone tower or a transmission line tower that's going to have a very negative visual intrusive impact on the resource? Atmospheric effect, like Chris just put in the chat. This is a really great example of an atmospheric effect in 9 Mile Canyon. So the road through 9 Mile Canyon in Carbon County used to be dirt. So these big oil rigs would drive on these dirt roads and kick up a lot of dust. And if anybody's ever been to 9 Mile Canyon, you'll know that it's considered the world's longest rock art site or rock art panel or art gallery, I think. The rock art or the rock imagery is right on the road, a lot of it. So literally, like you pull off, it's like literally right on the road. So in that situation, as these oil rigs were driving, kicking up dust, it was going directly onto the rock art panels, that rock imagery. And that was causing an adverse effect, maybe not one time, but over time, as that dust begins to accumulate on the rock imagery, which is very, very sensitive, over time, that was going to have a negative atmospheric effect. So when you're assessing your adverse effects, you want to consider cumulative effects, what can happen over time, visual, atmospheric, auditory. Another example of, I guess, an atmospheric effect would be, if you are doing seismic testing and like the ground is actually shaking a lot, is that going to like displace artifacts or do something negative to a historic building, that kind of thing? That's another example of an effect. Reasonably foreseeable effects later in time, at a distance, cumulative, like I just said. These are more difficult to assess, I would say. It's harder to say like, oh, this could potentially happen over time. But it is something that you do have to consider when you're applying your criteria of adverse effect, or you're trying to determine if you're going to have an adverse effect. And then consider all qualifying characteristics of a property. So a good way to explain an adverse effect, other than just like the list, which includes like physical destruction or damage, moving a historic building is actually considered an adverse effect as well, because it loses the integrity of location. If your undertaking is going to do something to the historic property that is going to make it not eligible for the National Register, that is considered an adverse effect. So say, just, fairy tale land, if you do your undertaking and without consideration, and then an archaeologist comes later, or an architectural historian comes later, and they actually assess the significance again, and they say it's not eligible anymore because whatever that undertaking did actually altered it enough where it's not going to be eligible, that's considered an adverse effect. So you always kind of want to think of what your effects are going to be, what characteristics you have, what's the historic significance. Again, think broadly about your adverse effect. And SHPO is also here to advise. We do get a lot of questions on, hey, do you think this is an adverse effect, or could this be no adverse effect? And that's one of the things that we always like to talk to people about and advise on. So say you applied your criteria of adverse effect and you determined that you do not have an adverse effect. Yay, because nobody wants an adverse effect, right? That means that you have a no adverse effect finding to historic properties. At that point, you're going to notify SHPO, you're going to notify consulting parties. And if no objection by SHPO, we agree. We'll send that letter back. We say, yeah, we agree with your determinations of eligibility. We agree it's no adverse effect. Section 106 is complete. You do want to keep in mind, though, if there are stipulations like, hey, we're going to do hand thinning on a vegetation treatment project, instead of doing mechanical vegetation treatment on this very sensitive archaeological site, we're just going to go in and we're going to hand thin the vegetation. So it's just going to be people walking over the site. We're not going to have big machinery driving over the site. So we think that's no adverse effect. And SHPO agrees. That's great. But you also want to make sure you're following through with that. So when you're doing your undertaking, you actually do have to hand thin within those archaeological site boundaries. You can't drive machinery, otherwise we're going to have what we call, a post-review adverse effect, which is actually outside of the Section 106 process. So agencies want to follow through on stipulations that they are agreeing to in consultation. If a SHPO or another party disagrees, the agency can resolve or ask the ACHP, the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, to review. This happens very rarely, if ever. So this is like when the agency and us, we just can't agree. We just can't agree that it's no adverse effect. Maybe we think it's an adverse effect and the agency just really says it's a no adverse effect, and we cannot come to an agreement. That's when cases like this might rise to the ACHP, and they can become involved and resolve those issues for us, help us get through that difficulty. An agency, yes, Chris.
I just want to also add to that point that it's not always just us and the agency that have a disagreement. Sometimes a consulting party that was involved in the undertaking disputes the no adverse effect finding. Even if we've concurred as the SHPO, they still have the right to disagree with that finding of the agency. And that does happen commonly in certain parts of the state with very controversial projects or very maybe precedent setting effects, that some consulting parties feel that the process wasn't properly applied. And so those do happen, and those can come from external consulting parties, but they have to be involved in the 106 consulting party process to have that right to sort of dispute that finding. But those do happen, not necessarily between us and the agency, but sometimes from external consulting parties.
Thank you, Chris. And we have a question in the chat. What are the consequences for failing to conduct proper Section 106 assessments? I don't really like the answer to this question. There are no consequences from SHPO. There are no consequences unless an organization decides to challenge you, like Chris was saying. The BLM gets this a lot. They have a lot of scrutiny. They have nonprofit organizations looking at everything they do. And they might sue. They might decide to sue for not following Section 106. And that's why ultimately your agency is responsible. And that's why everything is documented, because your process should be legally defensible, as Chris said at the very beginning. So there are no consequences unless somebody would like to legally challenge your agency. Obviously, ethically, if you do not do Section 106 or you don't do 404 and you go and you destroy a bunch of archaeological sites and say nobody ever finds out, but that's a big bummer, right? We just lost a bunch of history that we maybe could have mitigated, we could have excavated beforehand, or we could have avoided those sites. And we could have helped preserve our past that's irreplaceable. So that's kind of like the ethical answer. But I don't know, Chris, do you want to jump in on that?
No, I mean, that's sometimes the unsatisfying answer, is that there aren't a lot of consequences for those that blow off consultation, but really that's a high risk, low reward proposition. And probably the worst that will ever happen is your soul will be stained for all eternity with the darkness of which you've just done. So
yeah. And
then Matt just threw in the chat, Matt Davidson from USDA Rural Development, that if someone avoids doing Section 106, the project could be pulled, the project could not be funded. So yes, so if the agency is not supporting the circumvention of Section 106, or the idea of anticipatory demolition sometimes comes up too, of project proponent knows they have a historic building and they're going to go for money, but they intentionally demolish a historic building before asking for those funds. There is a provision in 106 that does bar anticipatory demolition. So thanks, Matt, for that extra level.
Yeah, I think this is something that compliance officers and compliance advocates have been trying to get across for decades now, but it's a lot easier just to follow the process. Some agencies try to skirt the process, and in situations like the Fort Douglas discovery, it actually cost them a lot more money and a lot more heartache in the end to have an inadvertent discovery, have to stop their project, have a full-scale archaeological excavation, all of that, rather than if they were to just do the process up front. And so that's why Chris had that slide at the very beginning that said it's a planning tool. Consultation and cultural compliance is a planning tool, because it really is. Just like you usually have to consider your endangered species or any natural resources under the NEPA, under the National Environmental Policy Act. There's things that need to be considered with projects and undertakings. And Christopher Carambulas, who is an archaeologist for FLIPCO, just put in the chat, the litigation consequences can be quite severe in terms of time and money, the travel management settlement agreement. So that agreement that he referenced is a multi-million-dollar lawsuit that the BLM is involved in over cultural resources. So unfortunately, that's a lot of money that the agency is losing from, maybe not complying with Section 106 enough. They actually did do Section 106 in that situation, but it wasn't considered to be adequate in that situation. But that is a very complex case. On to step 4, which is you have historic properties adversely affected. This doesn't happen a lot, but it does happen. Right? It's the 4th step in our Section 106 process. And, it's the same with 404. The agency proposes an adverse effect finding to SHPO. Usually that's done as the same as the other consultations happen. You send us a letter with your determination of effect or your finding of effect. If you have an adverse effect, most likely we're going to agree with it. And then it starts a whole nother process, which we're avoid, minimize, or mitigate adverse effects, which is there in that little box at the bottom. Agency continues consultation with SHPO, other consulting parties, to explore alternatives that may avoid, minimize, or mitigate. So that is usually resolved or outlined through a memorandum of agreement in the Section 106 federal process. So say we've gone through all the steps, we have an adverse effect. SHPO has concurred with that. We agree. Then we're going to probably execute a memorandum of agreement, which is just a fancy way of saying it's a legal document that is going to outline usually mitigation for that historic property or those historic properties that are adversely affected. Usually the ACHP, the Advisory Council, is notified of adverse effects and invited to participate. Most of the time, they will decline participation in the agreement. Usually they're low, easy projects, low hanging fruit. We do have larger projects that might be controversial, and in those cases, the ACHP may decide to participate. However, those are usually programmatic agreements, which I'm sure you've heard. A programmatic agreement also is another agreement that we use, another legal document tool that we use to mitigate, minimize, or avoid adverse effects. A programmatic agreement is usually executed when we have a very large and complex project. Say there's like a ton of historic properties. We don't necessarily know the exact effects to those historic properties. A good example is the Uinta Basin Railway that's being proposed in eastern Utah. There's 3 alignments to that railway. There's 3 potential alignments, and they don't know which one they're going to use yet. And so it's very hard to determine what the specific impacts are going to be if they don't have their selected alignment yet. And so in that case, we executed a very large programmatic agreement that outlined roles, responsibilities for all the agencies involved, all the consulting parties involved, all the tribes involved, and what's going to be done to mitigate adverse effects to historic properties. This little orange box here, not applicable to 98404. That means the legal document portion. So if we have an adverse effect under a state undertaking, we still have to mitigate, okay? But we actually don't have to legally execute a memorandum of agreement or a programmatic agreement. A lot of the times with the state undertaking, we'll just work out with the agency what the mitigation is going to be. Usually that's written up in a consultation letter, so we have it documented, we have it on record, and then we kind of work together and the agency implements that mitigation. So a memorandum of agreement is only required for the federal portion of cultural compliance. And let's see, that's the conclusion of step 4. So that's the last step of section 106. I will say that your memorandum of agreement, which is a whole other process in its own, right? It's very actually similar to section 106. You got to write it. You got to invite SHPO and consulting parties for a 30-day review. You've got to address their comments. And then once it's executed, which means all the signatories have signed that agreement, then the undertaking can be implemented. So memorandum agreements usually take longer to implement. Once you actually do your section 106 process, then you do your memorandum of agreement, then you mitigate, right? So if there are stipulations saying you are going to excavate the archaeological site before you trench through it and destroy it, or you are going to document that historic building in very intense standards, right, to very detailed standards, that has to be done before the undertaking happens. And so those are just extra stipulations. It does take longer for an adverse effect. So we say that, if you have an adverse effect, it does not stop the project. It does not, section 106 and 404 do not mandate preservation. It just takes a little longer to work out legally who's going to be involved, what's going to be done before that undertaking happens. And so we don't lose priceless information that could be lost from that undertaking. So that's what your mitigation is. So if we have, as we're continuing consultation for a memorandum of agreement, if we have a failure to agree, that's another situation where it's going to rise to the level of the ACHP. And the council, like I said, they do usually are invited to participate in memorandum of agreements and programmatic agreements. A lot of the times they'll decline participation because, it's a simple project, they don't need to be involved. But we do have several projects where the ACHP has been involved because they are large and controversial. And Utah has a lot of public lands and we have a lot of public land controversy. And so that does play into section 106 and cultural compliance as well. And so, there's controversy and that's why the council will get involved a lot of the time. And also in our 404 process, we have the Public Lands Policy Coordinating Office, which is PLPCO, and we have Chris Karambolas here from PLPCO. And in the state process, we can also bring in PLPCO if we have controversial issues like that. Okay, so that's the process, guys. It's a lot, but it's pretty simple once you get the hang of it, and also if you use your resources. And so we're going to share a couple of links here in a few slides of the ACHP Citizen Guide. So it actually, has a very simple resource of how the public can understand Section 106 or people that don't know Section 106 very well. Luckily, the ACHP, this is from them, this graphic, they have developed a ton of materials for Section 106 compliance. And they are a great resource. And more principles to remember. And Chris wrote these, so I'll try to do the best I can explaining them. Many projects do not involve historic properties. I actually changed this, Chris, I'm sorry. It originally said most projects. But in my experience, many projects do not. Not all. There are still lots of projects that involve historic properties, especially those projects that are happening on our public lands in Utah or state lands or state parks, that kind of thing. So luckily, a lot of undertakings are simple. You have your identification efforts and you have nothing there. You send it to SHPO, process is over. But of course, we do have big projects and small projects even that have historic properties, and we have to work through assessing adverse effects and potentially a memorandum of agreement or mitigation for adverse effects. The agency is ultimately responsible for all decisions, including how the process begins and ends. So SHPO does not dictate the process. The agency dictates the process. And I think we've kind of hounded that into you a lot. That's because you guys are legally on the hook for this. SHPO is not legally on the hook. We participate in Section 106. We provide comments on these undertakings through the law, because that's what is our defined role in 36 CFR 800 and UCA 9-8-404. That is our role. We do not enforce, and we are not legally responsible. So that is the agency. That's you guys. Everything is documented, and that goes into that. Agency is responsible. So if you are challenged, you want to have documentation. You want to be able to prove that you did follow the process. SHPO did confirm, right? Notify the public and seek comment when required. That's going to be mostly in the federal process through all 4 steps. Usually your public is going to be organizations that are already kind of actively involved in processes like NEPA, processes like Section 106. Very rarely do we get individual members of the public participating in Section 106. And, it's kind of a bummer because most people don't really know what it is or how to participate. So maybe that's something that we're going to try to work on at SHPO, and the ACHP has their citizens guide for members of the public. But usually, like I said, the public means organizations or nonprofits or individuals who are involved in the field and are going to participate in the Section 106 process and kind of know how it works and when to comment, where to comment, that kind of thing. Properties determined eligible for the National Register receive the same level of consideration as those already listed. I think I went over that pretty well. So they're treated the same. Doesn't matter if it's listed or it's just eligible for. I would say we have like 110,000 documented archaeological sites in Utah. Probably like 40% of those are eligible for the National Register. So that's like 60,000 sites we have that are just documented. You know, there's many more undocumented that could be eligible for. So we have a ton of resources in Utah. We have a ton. And even if they're eligible for it and they're not listed, they're still considered the same in the process, and they have to be considered for effects. Most cases are resolved at the state level between the agency and SHPO. We very rarely have a dispute that rises to PUBCO or that rises to the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. Luckily, we like to think of ourselves as a nice SHPO. I hope people agree with that. We like to work with people. We want things to work out. We want processes to be smooth and streamlined. We don't want to make archaeology the problem. Okay, we don't want to further the misunderstanding that archaeology stops projects or archaeology is going to slow down projects. So we want to make sure that we can keep this cultural compliance law, this UCA 9-404 in our state, and still preserve resources where we can. The process has no predetermined outcome. A lot of the times people will come to me and say, I think I have an adverse effect. What do I do? Okay, let's step back a little. Okay, you might not have an adverse effect. First, let's actually go out there and identify and evaluate the significance of the resource maybe that you think is that will have an adverse effect to it. Let's evaluate your effects in depth. Let's make sure that you don't have an adverse effect, because we don't want to unnecessarily, do those extra steps of a memorandum of agreement or a programmatic agreement if we don't have to. So just take the process one step at a time, because there is no predetermined outcome, right? We maybe can do something that makes it a no adverse effect. And so there's always things that we can do and we can work out together. Something always gets done, right? The process is based on good faith effort. That is a term that is in the law. So that's in 36 CFR 800. Agencies have to make a good faith effort to identify historic properties. They have to make a good faith effort to consult with tribes. I don't know if there's a super legally defined definition for what good faith is. But you have to make a good faith effort. So that's kind of the standard here. Section 106 of NHPA does not require preservation, only that the archaeological and historic resources are considered in the undertaking, in your project. Here is the Citizens Guide link that I've been talking about. And again, we'll send out this presentation so you guys have access to this. The National Register of Historic Places, there's a link to it. You can just Google it, to be honest, it'll come right up. One thing that is a good resource as well is National Register Bulletin 15. That actually has a very detailed guide for how to evaluate significance and integrity for historic properties or for cultural resources. We didn't go into it today, but it's very detailed. Certain aspects of integrity are more important for certain criteria of significance. And so that is all outlined in National Register Bulletin 15. And if you just Google that, it'll come right up, and it's a great resource to always reference. I reference it a lot if there's an issue or I'm evaluating an eligibility that an agency has submitted. It's a great reference, and so is 36 CFR 800, which you can just Google and it'll come right up as well. You always want to make sure you know exactly what it's says in the codified law, if you are carrying out section 106 yourself, or UCA 9-8-404 if you're a state agency. And then, of course, feel free to call, email us at the SHPO. So I do want to say we do have a lot of consultants on here, some private companies that do cultural compliance work for agencies. If you are a consulting firm, we ask that you do try to talk to your agency first. If you're looking for a consultation letter or something, try to get it from your agency. If you do want to talk to SHPO about something that's very SHPO specific, that's fine. Maybe make sure your agency knows. We don't want to cut anybody out of the process. We don't want to be talking past each other. So it is appropriate to contact us, but make sure your agency knows, you know, and it's an appropriate thing to reach out to us. But other than that, we are here to advise, to assist. Like I said, we're not here to make decisions for you, but we can help you reach those decisions, right? So that is the end of the Section 106 presentation. Chris Hansen and Chris Merritt, do you want to add anything?
No, Savannah, you did a great job boiling down a fairly simple but yet very complicated legal process. Hopefully some of you that started this training as minimal, you've moved at least a little bit more into moderate, but we understand a lot of the concepts here and a lot of the particulars are a little bit esoteric until you're actually in the weeds on it. So thank you, Savannah. Also too, if anybody has questions, put them in the chat, or if you want to, if it's more complex, feel free to raise your hand while we wrap up this portion.
And we do have another poll. So this one is more difficult. It's got a lot of questions before we go to break. So any pressing questions before we have that last poll on our compliance? Okay, I'm going to launch the poll and then.
Chris Crambless has his hand.
Okay. Go ahead, Chris.
Hey, first of all, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Excellent job, guys. Savannah and Chris, you guys, this was a great, good little refresher for me. You've distilled it down really well. I just wanted to, I don't know, maybe I want to be the fly in the ointment here a little bit. When it comes back to the first couple of steps, identifying an undertaking and determining if that undertaking is something that can cause effects on historic properties, and then moving to the identification phase. Sometimes, as Chris Merritt might say, things are a little bit more nuanced. Land managing agencies, if they have a project, will oftentimes declare the whole project an area of potential effect. But what I've noticed in a lot of, or in some regulatory agencies, the entire project area may not necessarily be the entire area of potential effects. Or, and I'm thinking of two things, and Chris, you may not, might roll your eyes at me bringing this up, but we had the Fish and Wildlife Services incidental take permit in Washington County that we really had to wring our hands on a little bit. And I think we came to the right decision. But then there's also the Army Corps of Engineers Section 404 permits, which allow waters, jurisdictional waters of the US to be dredged and or filled within a project area. And on that one, I would be interested to know your opinion on, let's say you have a 160-acre project area, you're doing a nationwide permit to fill 1/10 of an acre of wetlands. What's your take on that as far as what ought to be the area of potential effect?
So I'll field that, if that's okay, Savannah or Hanson. So what Chris is getting at is two things. One, the applicability of federal control on whole project areas, and then your scope of what you're going to go through for assessing undertaking. So very quickly, the Habitat Conservation Plan is a Fish Wildlife Service plan that works with cities or counties to establish what kind of incidental takes can occur within that area. And an incidental take could be plants, animals, anything. In this case, it was a desert tortoise. And so if the Fish Wildlife Service is merely creating a plan of like how the county or a municipality would move through removal of the tortoise, they're not actually authorizing ground disturbance. They're not authorizing anything like what's the scope of their need to do identification. And that was a little bit tricky because they're not directly authorizing those actions. They did an identification, sort of a class 1, what we consider a literature search, and we did execute an agreement with Fish Wildlife Service on, in those cases that there is ground disturbance, like they have to go dig a tortoise out of a burrow to relocate it. This is the steps that they would follow. And so we found a good solution, but yeah, they didn't have to inventory all of Washington County in order to complete the 106 process. The second one, which is a very national argument, and I'm going to give you a very unsatisfactory answer, Chris, is the role of the Army Corps permits. And so for those of you on the phone that maybe this is way too weedy for you, basically the Army Corps permits, jurisdictional wetlands. And so if someone's been building a Walmart and Walmart is going to have to impact 0.1 acres of a wetland, the Army Corps has authority to do that permit for that 0.1 acre. So they have to get an Army Corps permit for that one piece. The way that the Army Corps has interpreted their scope is that that does not make the entire Walmart development a federal undertaking. Their limited authority is for that 0.1 acre. And so only in very unique circumstances would that entire project get federalized. And I do think that the rationale the Army Corps uses for that is thoughtful. And I do see where they're coming from, is that they don't have authority on the entire rest of the project. So why would they be taking into account that action on the rest of that parcel? Other parties disagree that they actually do federalize the entire project. In 106 law, we use what's called the but-for clause. Could this project move forward but for the Army Corps permit? So meaning that if the Army Corps denied that 0.1 acre permit, would Walmart still build its distribution facility? If the answer is yes, then the project's usually not federalized, meaning that they could avoid using federal permit money or action or land. Therefore, they could move forward without that whole 100 acres being a thing. Others would say that, well, if you have to get that Army Corps permit, then that entire project is now federal. And so it's a national debate. The Army Corps is very much like, we want our 0.1 acre. Other groups want the entire project, shouldn't fall under 106. And I'm listening to those conversations.
Thank you, Chris and Chris. Yeah, you bring up a really good point about a connected action. So sometimes if we have a project on private land, but there's just a teeny federal part or a teeny state part, oftentimes that entire project could be, compliant to the process of state and federal. So I'm going to go ahead and launch one more poll and then we will take a break, I promise. Okay, this poll is, am I an undertaking and what is my determination of effect? And so there are kind of some situations actually based off real life on whether or not it's an undertaking and what the determination of effect would be in that situation. So I'm going to go ahead and launch it and give you guys a few minutes because there are, let's see, 7 questions. So go ahead and take your own time.
So
All right.
Carl had a question real quick before you close the poll there, Savannah. So Carl, it depends, right? If your agency, I will not name, decides to do some sort of a ground disturbing activity that will have an adverse effect, and you're a state agency, so there is no necessary requirement in state law to have an MOA in the description that Savannah did. We try to use them just because they are appropriate tools for having that agreement. But an agreement between us 2 state agencies, we could hammer out pretty quickly, right? Because there's no consulting parties, there's no additional steps. It's really a 2-party agreement. If it is a Native American site, we would urge your agency to contact tribes and work with them and get their comments, even though it's not required under state law. But the executive order that Governor Herbert did about 10 years ago at this point urges. So it depends. If you are going to have an adverse effect, we could hammer out an agreement pretty quickly, like a couple weeks, I guarantee. But it's really a trick of, yes, your boss should give you time to do appropriate review, work with our office to do background review, loop in other archaeologists to help you do inventories. Like, you should be getting at least several months heads up to do this work appropriately for the preservation of cultural resources. And so, one of my hopes is to get in front of more agency leaders to give them the understanding that it's not fly by night all the time, that there should be some project planning, which is the whole point.
So this one was a little more difficult. Number one, am I an undertaking? USDA Rural Development is planning to award home loans to a new housing development in Moab, Utah on private land. Yes, it's a federal undertaking is the correct answer. Almost everybody got this correct. So that would apply under the federal funds section of Section 106. So USDA Rural Development is a federal agency. And they're releasing federal funds that have the potential, like building a new housing development in Moab, that has the potential to cause impacts to archaeological sites, probably. So yes, it's an undertaking. Number two, the Division of Wildlife Resources is funding a vegetation rehabilitation project for aerial reseeding on a recent burn scar. This one is a bit of a trick question. It's actually not an undertaking, because aerial seeding does not have the potential to cause effects to cultural resources. If they were funding an actual drill seeding on the ground or a vegetation treatment on the ground, it would be a state undertaking. But an aerial reseeding is not considered an undertaking. So sorry for the trick question there. Washington County proposes to build a new campground on private land, but they must obtain a right-of-way permit from the BLM in order to access and build the campground. Everybody almost got that right, 89% of you. Yes, it's a federal undertaking. It's actually one of those connected actions that we were talking about just right before the poll launched. That campground cannot go forward if they don't have that right-of-way permit from the BLM. Therefore, the entire project should be federalized or could be federalized. The Federal Communications Commission proposes to install a new 5G tower in Salt Lake City's Marmalade District. Yes, that is a federal undertaking. The FCC is a federal agency, and Chris Hansen does a lot of those reviews. There are a lot of 5G tower going up everywhere in the state, particularly in Salt Lake City. The FCC in particular has actually delegated their authority to consulting firms or to the actual proponents to consult with SHPO directly. So when Chris Merritt said that Sprint or Verizon, they actually do have to comply with Section 106 themselves, because the FCC has made an official delegation of authority. That is actually one of the only examples where a delegation of authority has occurred. In most all other situations and most all other undertakings, the agency themselves do have to consult with us. What is my determination of effect? A vegetation treatment project on federal land will use bullhogs and other machinery to clear vegetation for habitat improvement. The cultural resource survey yielded that there are 10 historic properties in the APE, but they will be, but only hand treatment will be conducted within the historic property site boundaries. And I hope it's cut off on my poll, so I hope you guys could see that whole question. That is actually a no adverse effect. A lot of you answered adverse effect, and so I'm thinking maybe it didn't show up, the whole question. But that's one of the examples I gave. So yes, there's going to be a large vegetation treatment project. You have, okay, yeah, that I'm sorry about that. This is my first time doing a poll on Zoom, so it was cut off. So in that situation, the agency was only going to do hand fitting activities within the boundaries of archaeological sites. Therefore, it would have been a no adverse effect determination. The next one was also cut off a bit. An architectural property that is eligible for the National Register is being rehabilitated with federal funding. but all work will meet the Secretary of the Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties / rehabilitation. Almost everybody got that right. Yeah, that's a no adverse effect. It follows those standards. The work is not going to alter the characteristics of that historic house that make it eligible for the National Register. And that's important too, that those guidelines, those standards are important because, you know, historic houses, they degrade. They are not necessarily safe in some, you know, electrical, that kind of thing. And so it's important to, you know, still follow the historic guidelines that are outlined in the Secretary of the Interior standards, but also make those upgrades to make it safe and livable for everybody. And also to, you know, revitalize so we can keep historic buildings and not tear them down. Let's see, true or false, the agency undertaking a project compliant to section 106 or 404 is ultimately responsible for all decisions made within the cultural compliance process. Most everybody got that right because I handed it a lot. Yes, agencies are the ones responsible for all decisions. So good job, guys. Sorry, those 2 questions got cut off. Apologies. It's good lesson learned for the future. All right, so I think we can go to break now.